So before we officially get started, we're going to be talking about related services and assistive technology today. Are there any questions or anything from last week, or questions about anything other than last week? No? Okay. Cool. Well then, as per usual, I have prepared some slides. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can have a look at those.
I have a question that it's, are we going to have class on the 11th and 12th?
The 11th and 12th of
November, which is Veterans Day.
Not the 11th.
Okay.
So Monday.
Yeah.
Did I put that we had class on that day?
I don't know. I'm just asking.
Okay. Well, I may have mistakenly put on the syllabus.
I don't think that it's on there. I updated my calendar the other day, and I don't think that it was on there.
But the Tuesday would be?
Yes.
Okay.
It's only the Monday that's the holiday.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have to miss Tuesday then. That's what I was asking.
Okay. Well, again, that's not a big problem. We'll have the recording up for you to access. Okay. So we often hear about special education and related services. Certainly related services can be part of special education, but sometimes you hear them kind of referred to separately. And does anyone know the reason why that is? Why do we refer to special education and related services?
You don't have to have the related services.
That's exactly right, Mara. Yeah, related services. You can still be in special education and not have any related services, right? However, you may require related services but not qualify for special education. And in that situation, what kind of services, or where would you be getting your services? Not from an IEP, but from a
504.
The 504 plan, exactly right. So just wanted to kind of talk about that distinction. And so what we'll do today is talk about related services and assistive technology. There are a number of different types of related services. The book, provides, a fairly comprehensive delineation of the related services that IDEA recognizes, and that courts have recognized, and in their rulings. It talks a bit less about assistive technology, and then it very briefly talks about transition services. Right? It devotes like 3/4 of a page to transition. But not to worry. In the summertime, we'll have a class entirely devoted to transition, and you'll get experience formulating a fictional or hypothetical transition plan. So, don't be too concerned if, you're interested in transition and, thought that maybe this was the only time that we'd be covering it is in this very kind of brief section of today. Okay, so to get started, we're going to play a little game, and the name of this game is it a related service or is it an assistive technology? Okay, and so I'm just going to flash some examples up on the screen, and your job will just be to let me know whether it's a related service, it would be considered a related service, or assistive technology according to IDEA. So the use of a timer in the classroom to help a student, with time management, to help a student with making transitions. Would that be an example of a related service or an assistive technology?
Assistive.
Oh, did I hear one of each?
I think so.
And so was it Nate who said Related service?
Yeah.
And what would be your argument there?
Well, I look at assistive technology more as like an FM device or text to speech, whereas a timer doesn't necessarily need to be technological. You could have a little hourglass timer. I have a bunch of those in my class.
Right. So you bring up a good point. Technology. Just because IDEA uses the term assistive technology does not mean that it needs to be, kind of quote unquote technology as we might understand it in the general parlance. So I'd like a timer, an hourglass timer would be an example of an assistive technology. Okay. Absolutely. But certainly, it could be, kind of part of a support that is put into place, in the context of a related service.
Yeah.
But the timer just in and of itself would be an example of an assistive technology. How about a seat cushion?
Related service?
Related service. Crystal,
Yes.
why is it a related service?
Because the seat cushion may help the child do better on their academics by helping them stay in their seat.
Good point. It could also be considered an assistive technology.
Really?
So this is an example of one that's kind of borderline, right? Because a seat cushion could, an occupational therapist who, is occupational therapy is an example of a related service, might recommend a seat cushion to help a child kind of, maintain, a more appropriate posture or position in his desk in the classroom. Or for your example, or, I know that some students with autism, the seat cushions have been developed that provide kind of sensory input for sensory integration issues. So it could be an example of a related service, or it could be an example of an assistive technology. So that was just kind of one of a borderline case.
So is timers either or is that just assistive technology?
Well, yeah, good point. I said it was assistive technology, and certainly it is. I mean, a seat cushion, it's not really a service, it could be part of a service, but the seat cushion, I guess itself,
Mm-hmm.
I would take the same stance as the timer. It's a technology. It would be considered a technology.
Interesting. I mean, it's a service
So,
provided by OT.
Right. So it's a technology provided by a related service provider. It would be the best way to think about it. Transportation support.
Related service.
Yeah, that's a pretty clear example of related service. A surgically implanted medical device.
Medical.
Right, so that's neither, right? The book talks a lot about the fact that surgically implanted medical devices or services that are provided or that need to be provided by a physician or a medical doctor are not considered related services. But there are some exceptions, and the book talks about those, specifically in the context of psychotherapy, and in the context of, well, let me ask you. There is one more context in which medical services could be considered a related service. Does anyone remember what that one is?
Is it psychological and?
So we mentioned psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Could go either way, and that depends on kind of how the state defines it.
Is it nursing services?
No. In the context of diagnosis or evaluation. If medical services are required for a valid or an effective or an accurate diagnosis or evaluation, Well, in that context, it would be considered a related service. Catheterization. Catheterization. Am I missing a T there? Catheterization.
Catheterization.
Catheterization. My autocorrect misguided me.
I think that's a medical related service.
Right. There's the textbook talks about a case, right? Like a landmark case that had to do with just this.
And it would be considered a health service and not a medical service, right? Because medical services can only be done by physicians.
You got it. And the case, and we'll talk a bit about it, you know, had to do with catheterization, and kind of the ruling that this was considered a related service and not a medical service was that it was a rather simple procedure that a lay person could learn to implement in like an hour or so, is the terminology that the textbook, or the time frame that the textbook provided. A substance abuse program that follows a medical model.
Is neither.
That would be neither, exactly. A substance abuse program, however, that didn't follow a medical model but used kind of a social work approach or psychological services, well, that could be considered a related service. But yeah, one that followed a medical model would not be considered either one of these. Physical and occupational therapy.
Related
Services, yeah, those are two of very common related services, along with speech and language therapy. Audiology services. Related, absolutely. And we already talked about this. I gave this one away already. A medical service in the context of a proper diagnosis or evaluation would be considered a
Related
service. Outstanding. A graphic organizer.
Assistive
A technology, exactly. Right. Even though graphic organizer might just be like it could be a notebook, or it could be like a calendar or something, or it could be on an iPad.
Well, I have a question about that.
Yes.
So I have students with accommodations of using a graphic organizer, or helping a student make a graphic, basically it's in the accommodations. So should that be being put in the assistive technology section of the IEP then?
Can't some assistive technologies in effect be accommodations?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that it can be in, does it have to be in one or the other place on the IEP?
No, I think it could fit in either section. It's certainly an accommodation. It helps the student to keep organized, and it can be defined as a form of assistive technology. So I think keeping it as an accommodation would be fine. I don't think it's something that's going to open you up to mediation or a lawsuit or anything like that. A complaint to the state educational agency. And lastly, AAC devices.
Assistive technology.
Yes. Augmentative and alternative communication devices. Okay, so now let's really get into the material. So what is the IDEA requirement? School boards must provide related or supported services to students with disabilities who need them when they are necessary for what?
the student to gain access to special education.
Exactly. Gain access, or if they're required to assist them in benefiting from their special education programs. And again, these are considered, we're just talking about related services at this point, adjuncts to special education services, additions to. Again, a student can be in special education and have an IEP and have no related services, necessary in order to benefit from her or his program. However, some students might. And we've already answered this question here, so we don't need to answer it again. We know that a student does not need to require these related services in order to qualify for special education. So what the term related services does not include, and we've talked about this a bit already, surgically implanted devices or their replacements, so like cochlear implants, or the optimization of the functioning, maintenance, or replacement of these devices. So if a student has a cochlear implant, for example, and it is not functioning properly and it required maintenance, well, that, the school district in which that student is a student, in which that student, attends school, would not be held accountable for, funding that maintenance or replacement if it was required.
So if parents can't afford that, who does help with that? Do you have to go to like a special community organization that would help pay for that? Because obviously they would need that to continue their education.
Right, that's a good question. I don't know if it would be medical insurance that would cover the costs of the implant.
Or does DD services help any? I don't know.
I work at a 100% free and reduced lunch school, and so all of our students are below the poverty level, and we have an entire room dedicated with people who help connect families with services, whether it's medical or vision or whatever it is. And so she is kind of the coordinator, and she'll help arrange things through OHP. So if parents have OHP, she can like pretty much make almost anything happen. It's pretty great. And so there's stuff out there for students whose parents can't afford it. As far as if you weren't on OHP or you were above the poverty level, I think it just comes down to insurance, from my experience.
Thank you, Becca. And so the case that we were talking about, or that I mentioned already, that had to do with the catheterization situation, was the Irving Independent School District versus Tatro. And this was back in the early 80s. And basically the US Supreme Court ruled that a school board in Texas had to provide these catheterization services during class hours to a student who required them, who had spinal bifida. And again, to reiterate, their argument was that since this procedure was relatively simple and could be taught to, for example, a layperson, a school nurse in under an hour, that it would not be considered a medical service. If a medical doctor was necessary to provide this service, well, it would have been a different situation. And so this is a very early case in which, this distinction between a school health service on one hand versus a medical service on the other was distinguished, or was attempted to be distinguished. And again, these boundaries kind of shift back and forth, and they're all based on, court decisions and new situations that are brought to the courts and arguments for versus against them. And we'll talk a bit more about this distinction between school health services and medical services a bit later in the evening. And so one of the significant aspects of this case is that it placed two limitations on the obligations of school boards to provide related services. So again, the court insisted that to be entitled to related services, the child must be disabled so as to require special education. The court pointed out that absent a disability requiring special education, the need for what otherwise might qualify as a related services, what might qualify as a related service does not create an obligation under the Act. And again, the Act that we're talking about is IDEA. But certainly, as we've already discussed, Section 504, you know, a 504 plan could be put in place for a student who doesn't qualify for special education, but might require a related service, such as, for example, catheterization.
I have a student, I'm the 504 case manager, and I have a student who has spina bifida, and we were all taught, well, me and 2 assistants, catheterization, and we do it 3 times a day, so.
Okay, and so
he doesn't have an IEP, he just has a 504, which, yeah, so.
okay, good. Well, thank you for sharing that example. The second limitation, the court noted that only services necessary to aid children with disabilities to benefit in their special education programs must be provided. And it doesn't matter how easy or challenging it is to provide these services. So school districts can't make the argument, you know, that the provision of such a related service, you know, if necessary, the cost or the difficulty of providing it is not a valid reason for failing or just not providing that service. So what this means, if a student is receiving a free and appropriate public education, a FAPE, without related services, they're doing fine without them, well then this means that they're not entitled to receive them. They're just simply unnecessary. Even if a related service might help that student, you know, benefit or access to curriculum to an even greater extent, that student still would not be, you know, legally mandated or legally allowed to receive the services. And again, we've discussed this already. Section 504 may require boards to furnish related services as reasonable accommodations to students with disabilities that may not necessarily entitle them to special education. Okay, so now let's get into some of the different examples of related services. So when are related services required according to the IDEA? I asked you all this question. The book talks about a few different situations. And Mara already actually gave us an answer.
When a student requires them to access a free and appropriate public education.
Yeah, exactly. And that means the services outlined in their IEPs.
Are needed for students to remain like physically in like a classroom or a program.
Exactly. So not only to access the curriculum, but to just to remain inside the classroom. And there's another example, or there's another situation, and it's related to the first one. Not only to gain access to special education programs and services outlined in the IEPs, but to make meaningful
Progress.
Okay.
yes, progress towards their goals and objectives. And the final situation when related services are required according to the IDEA?
Students' needs are intertwined, that they require integrated programs of special education and related services, I guess.
That's it. Yes, that's exactly verbatim from the textbooks.
Yeah.
Integrated programs of special education and related services. And lastly, if a student's progress toward their IEP goals and objectives depends on the resolution of other needs, the resolution of these quote-unquote other needs being met by related services. So transportation, if you had a chance to read complete the reading for this week, it's one of the most common related services that school boards offer to students with disabilities. And it's usually provided by vehicles that the district owns and operates. It might be provided by other private service providers who specialize in the transportation of individuals with disabilities. Perhaps public transportation.
Yeah.
Orientation and mobility. Well, orientation and mobility services are generally reserved for individuals who are blind or who have visual impairments. I mean, I would think that one could make the argument that a student who, had the capacity to learn to use public transportation independently, could qualify for a service similar to the type of services that visually impaired individuals receive in the context of orientation and mobility services. I know that in California we called it transportation training. In Oregon, is that a common term as well? Is anyone familiar with it?
So my stepson is in the transition program through PPS, and they have a program that goes through TriMet called RideWise, and it trains them how to be independent when riding TriMet.
Okay, what to do if you miss your stop, or
how to use the app, how to get from school home or to your internship and back to school or back to home,
right,
that kind of stuff. Yeah,
which certainly falls under the purview of orientation and mobility, navigating one's community safely.
At the high school in my district, there's a special education teacher that takes a field trip with students to get honored citizen passes. So if you go to I think they go to City Hall. I'm not really sure. They take public transportation, go to City Hall, meet, I don't know, a city official of some sort, and then they end up getting their honored citizen pass, so they get free transportation or reduced transportation. I'm not sure, but then they learn all about it there, and it's like a day field trip once a year.
Yeah, no, these are great programs. It's interesting. I've a lot of my work has been, with children, adolescents, and young adults with autism, and I've definitely worked with a few young adults who are very, their specific area of interest is public transportation, and the memorization and mastery of public transportation. For example, in California, we had BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit, which was a train. We had the city buses, the memorization of bus routes and how to get around. I mean, there was one student, I could ask him how to get, from point A to point B, or point A to all the way from point A to point Z, and he would be able to tell you what bus to take, where to get off, what transfer to make, what direction to go. It was an amazing, amazing feat. So basically, as the term transportation is used in the IDEA and its regulations. It embodies travel to and from school, between schools, and around school buildings. And we'll go into a bit more detail about the more and less frequently utilized forms of transportation that that the IDEA supports between these three different categories. And certainly transportation services are going to, they might require specialized equipment, adapted buses, lifts and ramps for people with physical impairments who ride in wheelchairs. Transportation might also include just transit from the home to a vehicle. And there was a case, there was an example in the textbook from an early case in Rhode Island, in which a student basically needed assistance just to get from his home to the vehicle that would be taking him to school. Door-to-door transportation. So, from one's home to one's school and then one's school back to one's home is really only required if a student is unable to get to school without such assistance. So if it's just impossible for the student to, to do this in any other way, for example, to get a ride with a parent or any other means. If IEP teams place students in private schools, they're entitled to transportation to those schools. When IEP teams place students in residential private schools, they must be transported between home and school during normal vacation periods. So these are, schools in which students, are kind of going away from home and staying for extended periods of time. They must be transported to and from schools during these normal vacation periods. And the book also talked about a few examples in which, or at least one example in which a family requested that a student, be allowed more trips back and forth from home to a residential program, and was denied by the courts that privilege.
Question for you. Up here in Wallowa County, where Mara and I both work, we don't have any residential homes. We don't have private schools. We don't have any of these things. So if we ever got, let's say, a really severe student that our schools could not meet their needs, and let's say the closest facility was LeGrand or Pendleton, would it come down to our school having to pay to have that child, but then they'd have to almost go live there? I'm just trying to figure out how that, obviously we try to take care of it best in-house, but that's just a thought for up here in the rural.
Interesting.
I'm just curious how that would work.
Yes, thanks for asking, Colby. I thought of that too.
And you're talking, it's just interesting, like transportation, we have a little tiny bus that goes, I don't know, Mara, help me out here, like it travels from Wallowa. Our whole county is only 20 miles long, really. Mm-hmm. Maybe 27 miles. And it maybe once or twice a day goes on multiple stops. But it's just interesting, like a lot of stuff we just don't have.
No. Right now, our one student in the wheelchair, the Head Start bus, after they deliver the kids, comes and then picks up one of our aides. The aide goes to the house with the bus, gets the student from the home, brings them to the bus, and then brings them to school. And then this reverse order, taking them home.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, like with the student she's talking about, or even down here, our schools are built, early 1900s. And so, and again, not the school's fault, not the school district's fault, not the kids' fault either, but getting these kids up and down these ramps are amazing. Mara can vouch for that. It's like I said,
kids in other classrooms.
Like
so the building, like the physical buildings themselves have not they're not ADA compliant?
Basically one of them, but one is not and one is, and so we are using the one that is now for him.
Well, right. So one of the one category of related service is alterations to physical plants, and that's exactly what is referred to. A physical plant is essentially a school, right? And it's not necessary that a school district provide alterations to every single school to make them accessible to students. For example, in this case, the student in a wheelchair, as long as there is a school that is accessible and there is a program at that school that is appropriate, well, that would not be in violation, according to my reading of the interpretation of the law.
Yeah.
But so how long is, like, let's say, for example, the closest program was here in LeGrand. How long is that drive one way?
Hour and 15, hour and 20, snow, hour and 30.
Yeah. So, I mean, if that was the case, I mean, I think that legally there would, the district would need to come up with a way to get that student to and from LeGrand or wherever she or he needed to go. Or maybe there would be, or maybe it would make more sense to take the student to a location that was further away that, was kind of a larger district that had like a residential program or something, so that this kind of hour-and-a-half commute each way 2 times a day wouldn't be necessary.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because we have in some cases such lack of resources in some areas, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, and like you say, it's really of no fault to the district. I mean, it's just a small rural area. It's not it's not like the San Francisco Bay Area. It's not a very urbanized metropolis. Like it's so a lot of these smaller rural areas, I think need to just do the best that they can, and when these situations do arise, well, they still need to follow the letter of the law, and so it's there would need to be a resolution made were it to come down to that situation. So interestingly, an alteration in the delivery of a related service can be considered a change in placement under the IDEA, which is somewhat interesting. And then a few just additional caveats. If parents decide to send their children to schools other than the ones recommended by school personnel, school boards don't necessarily have to require that transportation. It's only if the school district recommends the change in placement that the transportation would need to be required. And this second point kind of relates to the situation, Colby, that you were bringing up. There are cases in which students, they don't go home directly after school. They might go to a caretaker, and the caretaker might live outside of the district attendance boundaries. Well, IDEA does require that transportation be required, or that transportation be provided. And this was an interesting point, this third one. In the case that a student's parents are divorced and share custody of a child, if one of the parents lives outside of the district's attendance boundaries, the school district does not necessarily have to provide transportation for that student to that parent's home. However, the district would be required to be providing transportation to the home of the parent who lived within the district the district's boundaries. So again, you know, the textbook talks about all of these different cases that, you know, have been brought to different levels of the judicial system, whether state courts or the United States Supreme Court, that kind of carve out, you know, well, what exactly are the requirements of a school district when it comes to providing transportation. And there are many cases. You know, if you're interested in looking at more case law, a very helpful resource is called Wright's Law, WRIGHTS law. And it's essentially like a compendium of special education case law. And it's where I found most of the examples of the cases that I assigned to you all. It's a very useful resource, very user-friendly.
Does it seem silly that if you're a caretaker, you have to transport a kid to a caretaker, but that a parent, if the parent lived outside, they're not considered a caretaker? That just seems silly.
Well, it's not that they're considered a caretaker. The argument, at least in the textbook in this particular case, was that taking that student to the parent's home who lived outside of the district boundaries was providing no educational benefit. There's no educational benefit for it. It was more a convenience to the parent himself. And so that was the argument that was made in that case. Okay, 546. We'll keep on moving. So counseling, psychological, and social work services. The textbook talked about counseling services, and it defined them in terms of the individuals who are qualified to provide them. And I'm wondering, does anyone recall what types of individuals are qualified to provide counseling services according to IDEA's definition?
Social workers,
Yes, social workers.
psychologists,
Yep.
guidance counselors.
Guidance counselors, and then one very general term.
Other qualified people.
Other qualified persons. So, you know, I don't know what class of individual would fall under other qualified person, but we would have to look to case law to see, or to look into the IDEA itself to see if it provides a definition. Psychological services, they include counseling, psychological counseling, and then social work services. These can include group and individual counseling sessions. So certainly these are all very kind of an interrelated set of services. But I don't believe that, for example, a guidance counselor would be qualified to provide, you know, psychological services. A guidance counselor might not be qualified to provide social work services. So in those latter two categories, you know, specific credentials are required, whereas counseling is just kind of a more kind of general example of a related service. And so just some generalities regarding this category of related service. Again, they're only necessary if they're required for a student to benefit from them in their special education program. As long as a student is showing academic progress, if a student is showing academic progress without them, well, it would be very challenging to make the argument that you know, a student should be receiving counseling or psychological or social work services. If students, for example, with emotional difficulties, emotional disorders, autism, you know, are not able to benefit from their special education programs because there are other emotional problems or social challenges that are getting in the way of that, well, then certainly in that situation, these types of services would be you know, legally allowed, legally mandated. And so the textbook talks a lot about psychotherapy and whether it falls under the heading of psychological service or a medical service. Interestingly, depends on state laws governing who can conduct psychotherapy within a given state. And I thought that the textbook brought up a number of very interesting examples of kind of different ways about which they've gone to determine who is you know, capable of providing psychotherapy. Some states will only allow psychiatrists to provide these services. So a psychiatrist is essentially a medical doctor. Some states allow clinical psychologists. So somebody, you know, with a PhD or with a PsyD or with an MF or an MFT might be able to provide psychotherapy. And just a few examples, a few different examples of states that have, you know, went about, or that have different ways of determining who are, you know, considered legitimate individuals to provide psychotherapeutic services. In Illinois, non-psychiatric professionals can practice psychotherapy. And the textbook talks about a federal trial court case that decided that a school board was responsible for the costs of psychotherapy, even though the service was actually provided by a psychiatrist. So here we have a situation in which whether it was somebody who is a psychiatrist or a non-psychiatric professional, it didn't matter. In the state of Illinois, the school district was held responsible for the costs. I thought this was an interesting example. In Montana, they just used the dictionary definition of psychotherapy to determine, you know, what it was. And according to, I believe it was Webster's definition of psychotherapy, psychotherapy was referred to as a psychological service. And since a psychological service is considered a related service, well, the school district was held responsible for picking up the costs for psychotherapeutic services for a student. Other states have agreed, other courts have, you know, achieved rulings that since, you know, children can benefit from educational programs as a result of psychotherapeutic services, well, then it is considered a related service. So the take-home point here is that there's really no hard and fast definition with respect to, you know, who is able to provide a psychotherapeutic service that is, you know, common across all states. And then again, we've talked about this already. We don't need to spend any time on this slide. When required for diagnostic or evaluative purposes, psychiatric and other medical services are required as related services. Placement in a facility that provides psychiatric services that is primarily for medical or educational reasons and may affect the costs that school boards are required to pay. So if a student is, if a placement is, suggested in a facility for educational reasons that provide psychiatric services, more of that cost might fall on the school district. But if the placement is for medical reasons, well, then in that situation, the school district might be held less accountable for picking up the costs for that service. Moving on to physical and occupational and speech therapy. Occupational therapy, the definition according to IDEA, I'll let one of you define that for me. Services that do a number of things. There's some pages turning. Someone's looking at their textbook, hopefully.
Improve, develop, or restore functions impaired or
Right.
lost through illness, injury, or deprivation, or improve ability.
Exactly. Functions. Also, services to prevent the impairment or loss of functions in the context of early intervention. In the work that I did with kids with autism, the early intervention services, or in the context of early intervention, occupational therapy was a huge part of it. And we worked on a number of, different fine motor and gross motor, skill development. And this is more toward the end of, working toward the prevention, prevention of the impairment or loss of the skills. And what are some other examples of occupational therapy that you can think of that might be provided in schools?
Just different tools to help students academically. For instance, scissors you could use with your feet.
Yeah.
Even seat cushions are provided by OTs.
Exactly.
Um,
An assistive technology provided in the context of a related service.
yes. Even trying to think, is it OTs that like dressing knobs and different toilet adaptations?
Yes. Did you say dressing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Knobs for dressing and different tools.
Mm-hmm.
As simple as just different things with your pencil, different grips on them.
Yeah. So definitely kind of big grips to kind of facilitate the tripod grasp to improve penmanship, the ability to write.
Mm-hmm.
We just had an interesting thing happen in our county again. It's because of our lack of services. We had a guy coming from Baker, which is 2 hours away.
Yeah.
So you can imagine him having a 4-hour drive just to get here.
Right.
And so now we're contracting through our hospital. So we're no longer doing like through the ESD, we're now doing it through the hospital to get these services.
Oh, so the hospital has an occupational therapist on staff.
Yeah, that's a new change just this year. Let's try to help meet these.
Yeah, that seems to make much more sense. So occupational therapists provide a number of services in the domains of self-help and adaptive living, so eating and dressing. Functional mobility. An example of that is moving safely through school. So positioning, a seat cushion might be helping out with this, sitting appropriately in class. Sensory motor processing, so using the senses and muscles are another example of services that occupational therapists might provide. I believe, Crystal, you mentioned, scissors that can be used with feet. We've talked about writing, so tripod, different grips for pencils and pens, and also gross motor skills. So working on walking, athletic skills, proprioception, etc.
I was gonna say, so like what are those called? The compression vests,
Oh yeah, those. Yeah, we used to.
weighted vests, and
Yeah, we used to use the big therapy balls as well.
mhm.
We would use those in the early intervention program that I worked at. Brushing, so like kind of like brushing along the limbs was another strategy, a sensory kind of deregulation strategy.
Even like chewy necklaces. I've worked a lot with elementary kids, so
Yeah,
just
chewing, yeah, straws even. I
yeah,
had kids that like to chew on a straw.
a
Yeah,
lot of different
these are
stuff.
all example of like sensory kind of motor processing
Mhm.
things, and we all have sensory processing needs. Most of us are just better at kind of satisfying them in socially appropriate ways. Like maybe some of us bite our fingernails, or maybe some of us pick at our cuticles or chew on our pencils or pens. I mean, these are all examples of kind of sensory processing activities that that many people partake in. But I'm going to stop us there since we're halfway through. Let's meet back here at 6:11, and we'll resume our talks. So I will see you all in 10 minutes. Okay, well, let us resume our discussion on related services. So in addition to occupational therapy, we also have physical therapy. And just very briefly, these are services provided by qualified physical therapists. They could take a variety of forms. The point being that they must help the child, help a student, a young adult to access their special education curriculum to a greater extent than they would be able to without them. And again, that's a point to remember about all of these related services. There needs to be some educational benefit conferred by them. If a student is doing fine without them, then they would not be qualifying for them based on the IDEA's justification for when they are not appropriate. Speech language pathology. Again, these are services for the identification, diagnosis of speech and language impairments. So these can take, the form, these impairments anyway. Actually, let me ask you all, what are some examples of impairments that a speech language therapist might address in students in special education? So that's a very broad question, I understand.
Feeding protocol.
What's that?
A feeding protocol.
A feeding protocol.
Yes.
By a speech language pathologist?
There's one I've worked with that does that for students who maybe eat too fast. And have a seizure disorder and were apt to choke.
Okay.
So the one I've worked with has done a few feeding protocols.
Interesting. That is a new one to me. Any other examples?
Stuttering and letter sounds.
Right. So like the phonetics and stuff like that. Stuttering. Also pragmatics, the pragmatics of language, using functional social language. That's another very common.
Working with students who are nonverbal.
Exactly.
Trying to find their voice or sounds.
Right. Or just, teaching an alternative form of communication using an AAC device or, something like a PEX book or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Other thing too is select mutism.
Selective mutism, okay.
Yeah, they work with students who have that as well.
Working to overcome those situations in which they, are not speaking.
And then finding tools to help them.
Right. We used to do a lot of oral motor exercises in the early intervention program that I worked in. So things like, blowing raspberries, blowing through straws, looking in the mirror and just kind of, making certain shapes, smiling, frowning, just kind of working the muscles in the lips, in the area of the lips, and the tongue and stuff. So speech language pathologists are going to be providing a number of different types of services, all, in the most general sense, focusing on the improvement of language, the production of speech, and also the use of functional language. We talked about orientation and mobility. These are generally services provided to students who are visually impaired, and these are provided by qualified individuals, people who are trained in orientation and mobility service provision. So it is a very specialized area in the field. And again, kind of the The focus here is on the safe movement within their students' common environments, school, home, and in the community. Orientation. Anyone want to take a crack at what orientation means in the context of orientation and mobility services?
It has to do with orienting the individual to where they're at.
You got it.
So it's listening to sounds, identifying marks on like the ground or like bushes on the edge of like a walkway.
Right. Essentially knowing, teaching the skills necessary to know where you are, where you're going.
Yep, north, east, southwest, cardinal directions, and maybe using the sun as a direction.
Yeah. Good. And how about mobility? What does mobility mean in this context?
How to move around those environments.
Yeah, mobility. Moving safely through the environments.
And how to use, like, if you have a cane, using that appropriately, and how to use it in different environments.
Right.
And then also guide dogs.
Guide dogs. Mm-hmm.
And how to use them in different environments.
Exactly. So there are a number of different strategies. And I know that, smartphone technology is really come along kind of within this area of orientation and mobility, like Google Maps and stuff. I know can be very effective for people who are visually impaired.
And the guy who created the smart cane.
The what game?
The smart cane.
Oh, the smart cane. Yes.
Yeah.
I just saw one of my friends who kind of works in this area in San Francisco just posted an article about the smart cane. Other examples of related services: recreational and enrichment programs. Does anyone recall the definition of recreation according to IDEA?
I don't remember the actual definition, but it's kind of like summer enrichment or after school programs.
Yeah. Basically, it doesn't necessarily have to be outside of the context of school, but a lot of leisure and recreation enrichment programs do happen outside of school. So basically, services designed to increase students with disabilities opportunities to participate in them, and in some cases to actually create them from scratch. And that we'll talk about an example of one here in a minute. And so as with every aspect of special education, there are assessments of leisure function, and these assessments can be conducted in the context of recreational programs, schools, and communities. There are leisure education programs, therapeutic recreational programs and assessments. A very interesting area, actually, within the field of special education that I've not really done much research into, but certainly an important area that should not be neglected. And so IDEA does require the provision of non-academic and extracurricular services and activities, basically to the extent that students with disabilities are able to access them to the same degree as their peers who do not have disabilities. And so, these programs and services, as we've already talked about, can take place in a variety of different settings. They might be taking place at lunchtime, recess, in the context of sports, just other recreational activities outside of the school, special interest groups and clubs. Employment is another one.
So we have a program over here. So Ben Parks and Rec has a therapeutic recreation program.
Mm-hmm.
And so starting, I think it's the end of this month. So within the next week, they start swimming with life skills students. So
Okay.
the school buses are transported to the swim and fitness center,
Mm-hmm.
and they get to swim once a week.
Okay.
They do other stuff too, but that's one of the programs that's offered.
Yeah. And even in the work that I did with young adults who were already outside, they'd exited the school district services. We would do things like just go hang out at the mall, right? Just go be kid, even when I was doing like the early intervention stuff, we had social groups for adolescents. So we would go to the skate park, or we would go to a community center where there was something going on, and just kind of hang out, and which could be challenging, and especially since there was always like there always was an adult, myself, kind of shadowing a few of the kids, so it can be kind of ostracizing, but there are important domains in which to focus our efforts on building independence. And there are examples in which courts have required school districts to create programs, which I found interesting. And this was an example used in the textbook. In Michigan, a court required that a school board provided a summer enrichment program to a student with autism, where testimony revealed that he needed a program that included outdoor activities. They didn't have one, so they were forced to develop one. So I found that interesting. So Crystal mentioned this program. Do you all in your schools or districts know of other similar recreation programs or services?
Not by us.
What's that, Mara?
We don't have anything by us.
Okay. Nate, you were shaking your head, yes?
I mean, there's some, I guess there are accommodations that are made so that some of my students can participate in gen ed extracurricular activities. So I guess it's not really, there haven't been any specific ones that have been developed specifically for the kids in my class.
But there are efforts to integrate your students in pre-existing.
Yeah, we have a program here called SUN. It's like an after school, kind of after school classes in different subjects. Like you can take like a coding class or like a music class, or there's even ones that are just like basically it's like open gym, and they've made efforts to basically just recruit paraeducators to be present and give those students one-on-one support so that they can participate.
Yeah. At the community college that I worked at, in the Tools for Transition and Work program, a number of the students were very interested in manga, so Japanese animation, and they were so there was a special interest group there on campus that they were involved in. So school nursing services, another example of a related service. And again, the definition according to IDEA, these are just any services that are performed by qualified school nurses and are designed to enable students with disabilities to receive a FAPE. And so again, that's going to be a very broad range of potential services. we don't need to go into any examples at this point. But again, we mentioned this distinction between medical versus health services. Health services being examples of related services, medical-based services being examples of those that are not considered within the domain of related services based on IDEA's definition, except for specific situations that we've already discussed. And again, a health service is just one that can be formed by a school nurse or a health aide or any other layperson. And again, these are typically received as part of, just the kind of general range of school nursing services that are provided at a school. And, as long as by law the service does not require a trained or credentialed physician, well, then it can qualify as a health service. Medical services are a bit different. These require licensed physicians in order to be legally provided. And again, we've reiterated this. It's important to know, however, that except when they're required for diagnosis or evaluation, or if a state, has a very broad definition of who can practice psychotherapy, medical services are not required, are not covered or mandated to be provided by school districts according to IDEA. We've talked briefly about substance abuse prevention and treatment programs. Again, these are okay. Basically, if a student's substance abuse problem was, a result of his disability, a manifestation of that student's disability, and services were required or necessary in order to deal with the issue so that the student could, resume benefiting from his special education services. Well, a case could be made that a school district should be responsible for covering those services as long as it's not a medical model. It's not following a medical model. It's just taking advantage of one of these related services that we've already talked about: counseling, psychological, or social work services. Habilitation services. And so these are in-home services. And they, as the textbook indicated, they don't always fall within the definition of special education and related services. And the textbook gave kind of two contradictory examples. A student was in a residential program in North Carolina, and when this student came home, experienced very challenging behaviors, presented the family with very challenging behaviors. The family requested that the school district provide in-home services to help them control their son's behavior when he was home. The family was denied the request because the student was progressing, academically in the residential program. And so, again, the student was making adequate educational progress. And, if the court sees that, it's going to make a much harder, it's going to make it a much harder case to argue that additional services are required. And then there was another example provided, a family who requested in-home vision therapy. This was kind of a different situation because, without this vision therapy, the student was likely going to, suffer academically in the future. And so the argument was that in receiving this in-home vision therapy, the student would be able to, in the future, benefit to a greater degree from her special education program. And so the family was requested it. So again, all about access and benefit, and to what extent the requested service is going to confer those two outcomes. So cochlear mapping was, we've already discussed this. Since it's a surgically implanted medical device, a school district will never be required to have to fund, maintenance or replacement of such a device. Even though a cochlear device is likely going to help the student access her or his curriculum to a greater extent. It will confer educational benefits, but since it is within the purview of a medical device, that would not be the district's responsibility to consider. Okay, physical plant alterations. So again, we've talked about this a little bit. So it's never going to be the case that a court is going to rule that every single school in a district, especially, in a very large district, make every single building on their campus, equally accessible to all students with physical disabilities or other, impairments that might make it challenging for them to access a building that didn't have modifications or alterations made. But there's going to need to be at least, there's going to need to be a sufficient number of schools that do have these alterations made for these students. So there may, a court may rule that a district does have to, make 1 to 2, buildings, depending on the size of the district, ADA compliant and accessible to students with disabilities that would prevent them from accessing them were they not made in such a way. Okay, moving on. Parent and training counseling. This is another example of a related service. Basically assisting parents in the understanding of their child's their child's disability, what that disability means in the context of their child's education, what that disability means in the context of their child's development, providing parents with the skills that will be necessary to support the implementation of their child's IEP, or if their child is, within the age range of 0 to 3, their IFSP. Can anyone think of a skill that a parent would need in order to support the implementation of their child's IEP? What might be an example of that type of skill?
I think just how they communicate with their kids, especially if they're, communication, especially with students with ASD and or behavior, just ways to talk to them so they understand that kid understands their parents and parents understand their kid more. Right.
Or maybe it's, if we stick with the example of students with autism, and then this is an approach that, is suitable for students with a broader range of disabilities, like using social stories. Maybe they use social stories at school, to prepare students for new experiences or transitions, from one grade to another. Teaching a parent how to kind of use that intervention appropriately and consistently with how they're doing it at school. The implementation of positive behavioral support interventions. These are all examples that, you know, a parent might need to learn, or skills that a parent might need to learn in order to implement their child's IEP or their IFSP.
Yeah, or just providing them tools, or I don't know, that they can access.
Right. The skills necessary to interpret an IEP or an IFSP. Yeah. So skills of access. That's a good example as well. Like, however, with all special education and related services, the training and counseling does not have to be optimal. It should just, as long as the argument can be made that it's conferring some benefit, well, that's good enough, generally, in the eyes, or according to the definitions in IDEA. You know, benefit does not have to be maximized, does not have to be optimized. It just needs to be adequate. If there's, you know, if progress can be demonstrated, well, then that's okay. Residential placements. And again, a school district will be held responsible for the costs of this kind of placement only if this placement is, you know, made, you know, at their discretion. If a parent wants to move their child to a residential program and does so without the school district's, you know, agreement, well, the school district would not be held responsible for funding, you know, whatever costs are associated with that placement, the tuition, etc. If there are psychiatric components to these residential programs, the situation becomes a bit stickier for reasons that we've already discussed. And very importantly, residential placements are not considered to be related services if their sole purpose is to provide confinement. If it's to, you know, if the placement, the recommendation for the change in placement was, you know, not based on, you know, an educational need, but to maybe, you know, get a child out of the classroom or out of a school that was very behaviorally challenging. I mean, we might think of that as a form of confinement. Well, that's not a related service. There needs to be an educational benefit conferred by the placement. And so the last example that we'll talk about in terms of related services is teacher training. And again, teacher training is really falling under the purview of the administration of a school district. Parents can't dictate how teachers should be prepared or how their competency is to be measured. There's an example in the textbook about a case in which a family took a school district to court because they wanted their student's teacher to be trained in a certain form of like behavioral management that they were using at home that they had paid for. And so they wanted this consistency. But the parents lost the case because for the reason here, it is not a parent's position to dictate how a teacher should be trained. And so, you know, even if this, you know, even if a program or a, you know, an intervention or whatever it might be is effective, and you know, a parent is seeing success at home with it, they're generally not going to win the case if they try to, you know, start demanding that teachers or other school personnel who might be interacting with their child be trained in it. Okay, very quickly, talking about assistive technology. Kind of different categories in which it falls. It could be provided as a SPED service, as a related service, or a supplementary aid in service. So there, there are a number of different kind of categorical definitions under which assistive technology might be classified. Often it falls under the purview of IDEA's LRE mandate because it does, in many cases, give students with disabilities the opportunity to benefit from education in least restrictive settings. But again, it is not required. It's falling into the same boat as a related service, in that if a student is doing fine without it, well, and when I say fine, I mean educationally, they're making educational gains, academic gains, well, chances are it would be hard to make the case that a student should receive it. And IDEA does call for the use of school-provided assistive technology devices in the homes of students if their IEP teams decide that they need access to assistive technology in order to receive a FAPE. This can be a very challenging situation. When I was doing my early intervention work, I was working in the San Francisco Bay Area, so a culturally diverse environment, and I worked with families, a lot of families from India, and it was all, there were always I shouldn't say this. It wasn't always the case, but there were certainly a few situations in which, an AAC device was not being used at all in the home when it was supposed to be, when it was part of the child's, one of the child's IEP goals. And, this was, it really wasn't my role to get into why that wasn't happening, but certainly, I did experience it. In addition to assistive technology, students with disabilities that are entitled to have access to just any general technology whatsoever that is available to their neurotypical peers. And also, they are legally, they have rights to accommodations in order to use that general technology. And, teachers are on the hook for making sure that modifications to that general technology are provided. So screen readers for students who have visual impairments, for example. And lastly, just another point that I've reiterated here. If a student is doing fine without assistive technology, then there's really no need to assess whether or not they require it. If a student is receiving meaningful educational benefits in the classroom without assistive technology, well, then as a parent might be hard pressed to win a case that against a school district that their student should be assessed and provided with an assistive technology. And we've talked about a few different examples of assistive technology earlier in class. We're just going to talk very briefly about transition services, and then we're going to get out of here. And so these are to begin at the age of 16 in the form of an individualized transition plan, the ITP, and this is just part of the IEP. And as I assume most of you are aware of, the goals and objectives and services in an individualized transition plan are related to things like career development, also career awareness. So just kind of knowing what kind of careers are even out there or available in the community. Employment preparation. this can take the form of, formalized classroom instruction and, appropriate workplace behavior. More effective approaches are actual, vocational placements for students in special education during their transition programs. And I assume that in some of the larger districts here in Oregon, as was the case in California, that students do, once they reach the age of 16, get opportunities to experience different types of workplaces. So they get placements in different workplace settings, working with job coaches. I know that in California, we had a program called Workability, and Workability had relationships with places like Rite Aid and Safeway, Trader Joe's, so, Macy's. And so students would get to kind of, go work part-time at these different types of, places for 5 to 6 months at a time, just to get some practical workplace experience, and also to build up, a resume. The achievement of independence in general, it's a very broad goal. It wouldn't be a very good IEP goal or an IETB goal. We would need to, certainly kind of become more specific, where we, focusing on that in the context of transition. Integration in the workplace, we talked about that. Integration into the community, we've talked about, we've already talked about that in the context of the recreation and leisure services. What I don't have here is college, post-secondary education. So that should, provided that a student is interested in going that route, that should certainly be part of the discussion when it comes to the development of the ITP. As I mentioned, we'll talk in much more depth about transition in our summer term. This is just a very brief overview of some of the areas in which students are to be prepared within the context of the provision of transition services. That's what I had for the evening. Any questions before we sign off for the night? Okay.
No questions.
What's that?
So no questions.
We talked a lot, I know. I think long and hard about how best to cover special education law without as much talking. I've yet to come up with a way to do so. But this is the foundation of special education, so it's very important that we take our time to kind of work through all the different kind of nuances and aspects of it. If you have a chance to look at the Orlea test framework and read through the different kind of sections of that test, the test that you all will be taking, a lot of this stuff appears. It appears in about kind of 40% of the test, so it's very critical that we have a full understanding of the legal and procedural aspects of special education. But anyway, I will sign off for now, and see you all tomorrow for theories and characteristics of exceptionality.
All right.
So have a good evening, and we'll see you then.
Thank you. Good night.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.